how do tariffs affect the prices of your favorite consoles? And what does this all mean for companies like Nintendo? Well, this week I sat down with economist Dr. Kevin Neuman to break it all down. And I learned a lot, and I think you will too. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. This episode of the Gamerheads Podcast is brought to you by Seven Bridges Premium Gourmet Yum Yum Sauce. Enhance every bite with our savory blends of flavors, perfect for meats, vegetables, and crispy treats. Whether you're dipping, drizzling, marinating, grilling, roasting, or snacking, Seven Bridges Yum Yum Sauce takes your culinary experience to the next level. Get yours today and make every meal a gourmet delight.
Hi, I'm Celia Schilling from Yacht Club Games.
Hey, this is James from Megacat Studios.
Hey folks, this is Matt, aka Stormageddon from Reignite and the Fun and Games podcast.
This is Stephanie from the Boss Rush Podcast and the Boss Rush Network.
Hey, this is Mark and Keon from Bunte Avond.
Hey, this is Sebastian with the ProNerdReport.com and the Single Player Experience Podcast.
Hi, this is Chris.
Mike.
And Garrett from Daylight Basement Studio.
Hey, this is Baron J67 from Level 1 Gaming.
Hi, I'm Jacob McCourt from the Left Behind Game Club, Crossplay Conversations, and Video Game Trivia.
Hey, this is Todd Mitchell from Code Right Play.
Salutations, this is Mike Carroll from Stroll Art.
Hey, this is Jeff Moonen from Fun and Games Podcast.
What's good, y'all? This is Adam from Respawn Aimfire.
Hey, this is Patrick from the Backlog Odyssey.
Hey, this is Rune from Runic Codes.
Hi, this is Andrew from Spalato Bros.
Hi, everyone. Jill Grote here from the Indie Informer.
Hello, this is the Crypt Master, and you're listening to Roger Reichardt. You're listening to Roger on the Gamerheads Podcast.
And welcome to another episode of the Gamerheads Podcast. My name is Roger. Along with me, I have a very special guest. My guest tonight is Dr. Kevin Neuman. He is an economist and the head of Century School of Business and Economics at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. And he's one of my favorite people of all time. Kevin, thank you so much for joining me on the show. And thanks for taking time out of your schedule to talk about tariffs. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Tariffs.
Everybody's favorite topic these days, right?
Yeah. It seems to be the hot topic. And we should just say a little bit, like, everything I know about economics is because of you, because you were my professor when I was.
And so now I can acknowledge that, right? Because it's federal privacy laws. I can't tell anyone you were my student until you do.
Like 20 years ago.
Yeah. Doesn't matter, man. No statute of limitations.
Oh, that's true. So welcome to the show. Before we begin, because I have a lot of questions around tariffs, and this is a hot topic, especially in the gaming world right now.
For sure.
But tell us about yourself, and tell us, what is your favorite game of all time?
All right, so that's probably the second part of this is probably the more interesting part. No, anyway, yeah. I am an economist. It was one of those things where I didn't really know what econ was until I got into college, took a few classes, and really kind of saw it click, and it was nice. I'd always been interested a little bit in the business, world, but it was nice to see a little bit more in a broader context. You can kind of understand the system as opposed to, the specifics of it. But yeah, got into academics, and again, got back to Stevens Point, and had you as one of my first students, which was always pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's fun.
I know, like I said, it's been a long time, but we don't. I don't feel that way, so that's always good. But I will date myself with my favorite game, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess maybe there's not an all-time favorite. I'm going to give you a handful and a brief description.
Oh,
I think
probably a handful. Wow,
I mean, a handful, but we're all in the same general genre. So first of all, I have to say. Oh, man, there's two. Okay, so first of all, I will say Tetris on the old 8-bit NES, right?
Okay.
Huge fan. I went over 500,000 points, which isn't that impressive, but it was good for me.
Yeah.
Right, so that was always fun.
Yeah.
And I will say I'm a huge arcade Ms. Pac-Man
me too.
player as well. Yeah, big fan.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I'm trying to get one in my house, by the way. That's
yeah, I actually am too.
Yeah. Are you really?
Not that hard because it could happen, but periodically people send me these things like, hey, I think they're getting rid of it, but
yeah.
But I will say again, so that's kind of my genre, because I'll be honest, out myself a little bit, newer systems, there's too many controls. I never was good with the joystick, but I did like Bond on the Nintendo 64 GoldenEye as well. So there you go. And I do think Super Mario 3 on the NES is one of my favorite games as well. So there you go. So basically what it means is old and very outdated system. So how about that?
James Bond, like GoldenEye, was like the game to play when we were in college.
For sure.
Yeah, like that was like everybody played that game. So
yes.
And I should clarify. Can I just clarify one thing? Like, you had me as a student, but I was like, that was my second go around at the university. It wasn't like. I'm just saying that, like, we're the same age. I just want to make that clear.
Actually, I think you're older than me, is what I just learned.
Well, that's true. That's actually true. That is actually true. I'm like half a year older than you.
Yeah. Ancient.
Yeah,
really.
Ancient. Yeah, I did play. Pong was my first system. We were talking about this before.
Nice. I think I was playing on my cousin's old Atari. That was. I don't think I ever played Pong, but like. Yeah, Pac-Man and Popeye was actually one of my favorite games on an old Atari. Yeah.
Oh, Popeye was so good. I loved Popeye on Atari. I can't play it now on Atari because it's not that good. It doesn't feel that good, but at the time it did, right? But
it's not really. Most of the games are not really the same thing when you go back. But think of the endless hours based on like that type of graphics, and but it is, it is what it is.
You know where? Hey, one last thing. Nobody else will get this except for us because we're from Stevens Point. Do you know that they have Miss Pac-Man at District 1? Did you know that?
They do. I know.
Oh, okay.
It's awesome. I have never actually played there because I've been with people, and I'm like, yeah, but I want to go play that. And okay, so I got to throw one more game that, again, same era, but Romance of the Three Kingdoms on NES. Like love that game.
Yes,
absolutely.
That's yes. I think I could be wrong. I have to look, but that might be on the Switch Online now. That you can.
Oh, really?
Play. Yeah.
It wasn't like when little bit ago, because that's actually like when Reed, got his first Switch, and I'm like, we should go online and see what's on there.
I'll have to check. I'll have to double check, but I thought they added it, but I'll double check for you.
So I actually. At one point, like I think it was Console Classics, I think it was. Like you could download the app on the PC, and as long as like there were certain numbers of copies of games or something that people could play at one time, right? So I actually played it many years later.
Nice. Gosh, that's so funny. Well, we'll have to get together and play some Switch games or something like that, because
there you go. I don't know what it says to me that one of my favorite games was about world domination, or at least, in ancient China, but it is what it is.
Speaking of, we're talking about tariffs. Well, I do actually have a lot of questions about tariffs. So I think I have a kind of an understanding around what tariffs are, but I'm not 100% sure. So can you briefly explain what tariffs are and how they're typically used in global trade policy?
So, basically what it comes down to is if you think about the economy as a global, a global market, if everything was the same, right, all goods were exactly the same, right, and there was no transit costs or anything, you would get prices that were identical, right? And so it really wouldn't matter where anything was produced, and they're identical anyway, and it would be costless. There'd be one price in the world, right? That's what people pay. That's what clears the market.
Sure.
In reality, of course, goods aren't the same, costs of production aren't the same, right? And so you get these differentiations across, country lines. And so typically higher labor costs, maybe higher environmental standards. U.S. tends to have higher production costs. And so you end up producing things that, often will end up be higher price here.
Sure.
Typically that leads to the outsourcing, right? Or global supply chains. And so what has generally happened is, when we look at production facilities trying to get to lower costs of production, lower prices, you shift production offshore, or of course, you also have, foreign producers of similar goods. And so you end up having, a much broader market And you get a disconnect then between the price of, a good produced in the US versus a good produced somewhere else. And so if we're looking typically, and the motivation generally for, a lot of production going offshore from the US was because of, drive down production costs and therefore lower price, cheaper price for the consumer. So what we see then is there's a gap between, if you just had everything in the US, there'd be a price, certain amount that consumers demand, quantity they demand at that price. That's fine. Once you get lower prices, all of a sudden, right, if we can import those goods, you end up with really an inflated quantity demanded because it's cheaper, right? So consumers want a lot more than the US producers are willing to produce and supply at that price. So you get this gap. Yeah. And that gap, that excess demand for the goods is filled by importing from, other producers.
Sure.
These leads to the trade imbalances, right? So if we import more than we export to a country, you get a trade imbalance, and that's kind of the driver. It's the idea is we're buying more from them than they're buying from us, so we're sending money out of our economy, which is true. I mean, it's a that's just the math. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, right? Because U.S. consumers benefit significantly from lower priced goods accordingly, and your money goes further. And so it's not inherently a bad thing. And especially if you get into kind of the global supply chain aspect, if we're buying parts and importing parts at much cheaper rates, it drives down our cost of production. Even domestic producers, increase profits and increase, production. And so we benefit there as well.
Yeah.
But with these imbalances, what a tariff essentially does is it says, all right, well, that foreign produced good that we're bringing in is cheaper than a domestically produced, alternative. And so a tariff just is a tax, right? So when you hit customs, there's a tax on those goods that are brought in, and it's designed to raise the price of the foreign substitute good. So basically that's what it is.
But who pays for that tax? It's the consumer, right?
Well, yeah, right. I mean, basically, it depends how you want to do it. I mean, technically, the producer pays because it's an import duty, but that doesn't mean that they bear the cost, right? Okay. So there's the paying in terms of the actual logistics, right? Yeah. But then there's like who bears the burden. Yeah. And so what it comes down to is, I mean, if you raise the price of the cheaper alternative, all of a sudden U.S. consumers, well, they don't want to buy as much at that higher price, right?
Right.
And so what you end up doing is, right, you end up at a higher price for the good, and inevitably it will be more expensive to buy those, right? And most of the time with tariffs, they don't set the tariff necessarily above, to the point where you'd raise the foreign good above the domestic price.
Sure.
So
would you set it normally
cheaper?
It set it normally at even or maybe a little bit higher, just so that way.
Well, and it depends, right? It depends how you're using them. If you're using them in a punitive sense, or a completely to protect the domestic industry, you might actually set the tariffs at such a rate so that the foreign substitute is actually more expensive, right? That would be the classic protecting the domestic industry. And so, what happens is, I mean, it raises prices. There's no way around it. So yes, technically the importing or the foreign firm pays the tax, but the burden of that higher price that just gets built into the final price of the good falls on the consumer.
Sure, that makes sense. And the idea behind it then, right, is that then people will buy, lack of a better term, like locally, right? Like they'll buy from products that are built in the country that they reside in, right? So that way,
I mean that is the logic.
Right.
And so there's some different arguments, and there's the argument now where we've done blanket tariffs, there's not a lot of nuance there, right? I mean, it's just tariffs, no matter the country, the levels differ. So a classic way that they are used more selectively would be for a couple of reasons. One, maybe it's an up-and-coming industry that you're trying to protect. And so, honestly, China does tend to use trade protections like this to protect their native manufacturing, to try to get it up and developed enough so that it can be competitive enough on a global level on its own.
Sure.
Another would be, say, steel in the U.S., right? Argue that it's such a critical industry to critical industry to national defense, to manufacture, all these things in the US that if you didn't provide some protection from very, very cheap exports, we'd lose all our domestic steel production, and then you wouldn't have this critical resource.
Sure.
Right. So those are kind of the classic arguments, but they're typically short term. They're typically really targeted at one industry, and economists generally don't like that because we don't generally believe that government's good at picking winners and losers in industries. Right?
Yeah.
We tend to believe that individuals are kind of bad at some of these things, but like markets tend to sort things out. So
yeah,
where we have here then, so you're doing that to protect a domestic consumer or domestic producer. And so like the consumers pay, and a lot of that ends up in the pockets of the domestic producers who are now able to sell more because they artificially raise the price.
Yeah. But so one last question on that one, and then we'll go to my next question. But don't you have to have an infrastructure in place to be able to pull that off? Like if you don't have an infrastructure to build, let's say, electronics or even clothing, right? To be able to match the production level of what the supply and the demand that foreign countries can bring in, like isn't that problematic that you wouldn't be able to keep up with the demand and then the price will really go high?
Well, and that's the argument, right? I mean, so one of the arguments for tariffs. So, I mean, from a free trade, from an economist perspective, from an efficiency perspective, you're artificially raising the price. You're driving a wedge between, what consumers actually want to buy given the global price, and then what, people are willing to produce. And you're leading to inefficiency losses because you get this imbalance. People wanted to buy more, no one's willing to produce it. The argument then is, well, but people will bring production home, if you will. So it's only bringing it home, right? If it's a U.S. company who's been producing,
right,
in foreign markets. But the other argument is that maybe foreign producers, and Nintendo was the company that you brought up.
Yeah.
That in theory, sure, maybe they bring in production into the U.S. Because tariffs are not a tax on necessarily all of a foreign company's goods. It's a tax paid at the border. So if it's produced within the United States, you're already in, you don't have to import anything. Even if it's a foreign company, it wouldn't be subject to a tariff.
Yeah.
Now, if you're importing parts of it, like microchips, processors, that type of thing, any of the inputs that you import still would be subject to those tariffs. But in theory, it's a smaller value than the finished good.
Sure.
So one argument is we're going to create jobs in the U.S. because to avoid tariffs, U.S. companies will bring their production back home, and maybe foreign companies will invest in the United States. And yes, but as you said, there's a couple of problems with that. One, it's still going to lead to higher prices because the reason a lot of companies went abroad in the first place was to take advantage of more efficient production, cheaper production, costs of production elsewhere.
Yeah.
So even if you could seamlessly bring it back, it's still going to drive up the price of the product, right?
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, like, once companies make these investments and it's more efficient and more profitable to shut down production facilities and move them, like you said, they're not just sitting there. We didn't keep them up and running and continue to invest in a production facility that we no longer were using. And so, you can't actually just seamlessly bring things home. And even if you could, the nature of manufacturing has changed to the point where what we think of as high labor intensity manufacturing, like we used to have perhaps in the 50s and 60s, in the US, that's not the way it's going to look anymore.
Yeah.
It's going to be much more automated. So maybe manufacturing, I mean, even if you could get that level of production back into the manufacturing in the U.S. economy, it wouldn't employ anywhere near the number of workers.
And then going with that, though, like if you were to bring all the jobs back home, let's just say this is like the perfect world, right? And the production costs, right? Because, I mean, it's going to cost money to do that. So then the production cost goes up and everything. I feel like you can never remove the tariffs because otherwise they can't compete in the global market, because if the tariffs were to be lifted and now the consumer has the ability to buy foreign again, like foreign products, and the domestic product is too high because of the cost, if you remove the tariffs, then domestically they either have to bring their prices down, which if their argument is the cost of production is too high because we had to basically start the startup company, right, to move everything back home, that cost, we have to eat that cost somehow, either
Right.
pass it on to consumer or we eat it ourselves. I just feel like that seems like a spiral. Like otherwise, if you do, you remove the tariffs, and then those companies will go out of business because it's cheaper to buy, from foreign companies.
Yeah, or they adapt, right? And I mean,
Or they
we're
adapt.
also neglecting the fact that it's not like we are the only ones who can place a tariff on international trade, right? I mean,
that's the other thing. Yeah.
I mean, it works, and the only way you really can get away with it in a targeted sense is if it's a one industry, perhaps, and you're protecting it, and it's not maybe a big enough threat to foreign producers, non-U.S. producers, that they slap a reciprocal tariff on you. But as we saw recently, we put tariffs on everybody. Well, a lot of them place tariffs on our goods. So that imbalance that is deemed to be unfair, which really was benefiting a lot of the U.S. consumers because, again, they were able to consume lower priced goods. And let's face it, U.S. consumers do like their lower priced goods. And then not only lower prices, but just open access to a lot of things produced elsewhere that we may not have, right?
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of benefits to us importing more than we export, perhaps. But then, right, we may be really cutting down on our exports once they slap retaliatory tariffs on our exports. And that's usually the way it goes once you get into these broad things. So, yes, it does, it does generate some revenue. It could eventually, if it's long-term, possibly bring some production home, whether it's U.S. companies or bring in foreign production. But it's pretty unequivocally going to raise prices.
Yeah. So one of the things that Nintendo had bad timing, like it was just bad timing. They announced the new Switch, the Switch 2, and then later that afternoon, the tariffs were announced. And at that point, Nintendo said that pre-orders were not going to happen in the U.S. They were supposed to happen actually last week, Wednesday. But they said that they're not going to offer pre-orders because they have to determine the impact of the tariffs. One of the things that Nintendo did, though, is they actually moved production out of China because they saw this coming, at least with the tariffs with China, and they moved their production to Vietnam and Cambodia to avoid the earlier tariffs. But now, obviously, like you said, that there's this blanket across all these countries. What is the impact there? What is the economic implications with that in regards to how can a country adapt a company adapt and change when like all of a sudden like all this just happens so fast?
Right. Well, and like you saw, anytime you see different policy regimes, so economists really love borders on countries and counties and things, especially when they can make different policies, because you get these nice natural experiments where, right, things that are maybe a couple miles apart all of a sudden have vastly different policy regimes. So it's kind of fun that way as an empirical economist. But right, I mean, a classic way to avoid tariffs is, again, to move production out of the country that now is subject to a tariff. So moving. And well, we actually saw a similar type of thing, moving out of production out of China to Vietnam and Cambodia, probably 15 years ago, once Chinese manufacturing started to get more expensive. So U.S. companies and Chinese companies were actually moving out of China because their labor costs were too high. Now, tariffs are just a different cost of production than that those producers really would have to think about. And so, right, when you can do that and you have neighboring countries that you can relatively easily move production to with a little bit of investment, it's not costless, but where you can move into a lower tariff regime, you can avoid those costs. Now, of course, and that's one of the argument when tariffs are used in this context is, if you don't want anyone to avoid them, you have to apply them on everybody, right? And then the only outcome in theory is for they want to invest in or they want to sell to the U.S. market, not subject to tariffs. You need to move, into the U.S. market for production, which isn't necessarily easy to do. And so the impact there is, they did the best they could. and with the knowledge they had, they made made a decision, and probably was, profitable for a number of years until, the second administration and now the ramped up tariff policy. I think the problem that companies have is the uncertainty, right? And that kind of gets back to the longer term effects that you talked about previously, because it's not like, again, Nintendo doesn't have another production facility in Ohio that they're just keeping their, not using, but just keeping ready to go just in case.
Just in case, yeah.
And I mean, so, and you have to invest money. You have to bring money if you're going to shift production home. But that really only is productive and profitable if you actually think the long term is going to have tariffs, right? If you're like, oh, this will only be short term, you're going to take the short term pain, and you're not going to invest, millions of dollars to get a new production facility that all of a sudden is going to be too expensive if the tariffs go away. Yeah. So in that context, if Nintendo knew for sure that this is going to last for a really long time and there weren't going to be any exemptions and they were never going to go away, maybe, them and other companies would be worthwhile to invest. But in this era of uncertainty, I don't know. I think they're betting that the mood will change.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know I don't know how much you have a pulse on the game industry, but it's pretty, it's not very reliable. Like there's studios that shut down quite often. You have a company even like Google who created Stadia, however you pronounce it, right? And they shut down that, right? There wasn't like a game system, but it was online gaming, cloud gaming,
right? The streaming. Mm-hmm.
They shut that down like relatively quickly, right? Like, so there's no certainty in this industry to begin with, but then if you inject a level of economic uncertainty, like I feel like that probably doesn't help the industry very much.
No. Well, I'll throw something else into you too, in terms of who pays, right? And again, in terms of using that phrase in terms of who pays the burden. Well, then you have to get into the, not to get too economics, but the elasticity of demand, right? So like there's different types of demand where, very elastic demand that even a small increase in prices reduces the quantity demanded greatly, right? Things that are just, a lot of close substitutes, more commodities, right? If you raise the price of gas at one gas station, most people don't care if the one across the street, is 5 cents cheaper. That's where they're going to go, right?
Yeah.
Very elastic demand. But for things like, a new product for a specific company, very proprietary, kind of rabid fan base, all of a sudden you can raise prices quite a bit, and the quantity demanded doesn't go down by very much. Right? Some people are priced out and others just shell out the money.
Yeah.
Well, there's not you ask who pays it. Oh, clearly the consumer's there because there's no concern, right?
Yeah.
I can jack up prices by 20% because of this tariff and I only lose like 2% of my sales. Yeah, I win.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. But depending on, new releases of games and systems, I would imagine it's probably a reasonably inelastic demand, at least if there's, a fair amount of hype for it.
Yeah. Especially with Nintendo. I feel like the Nintendo Switch, people have been waiting since, a long time. And Nintendo fans tend to, I would say like any fan, but like Nintendo, they do generate this. It's like Apple, right? Like they generate a lot of demand, and you're right. I think people, so for me, the price that they have put forward is $450 for the base, and then $500 with bundled in with the new Mario Kart game. To me, that's like top. Like, I don't know if I could pay more than that.
That's where those media credentials and testing credibility comes in, right, Roger?
Not with Nintendo. It doesn't really work there. But I do think people are willing to pay more for a Nintendo product.
Sure.
And I guess that leads really well into my next question. If these prices go up because of tariffs, right? How likely is it that they'll come back down if they're lifted? And then is there a concern that the prices will stay elevated even if the tariffs are gone?
So, there's different theories here, right? Like if you're a perfectly competitive markets just adjust to the price, right? So in that kind of world, firms don't actually have any power over prices at all. They're just subject at the whims of supply and demand. we know the markets aren't truly competitive, right? Especially where, again, you get pretty differentiated products, brand loyalty. And so, yes, there's different gaming systems, there's different consoles, but when you're really in on a brand, right, they're very imperfect substitutes at best, right?
Yeah.
And so that does give firms some power over price. And so while what raised the price might have been out of their control with the tariff, you're right, when it goes away and people are accustomed, that becomes the new norm. Yeah, they potentially have some arguments about, why not to. And especially with, again, if they're judging, very inelastic demand like we talked about, even if prices go down a great deal, they don't actually increase the quantity demanded and the quantity sold very much. And so you actually, lower prices. Yeah, you sell a few more units, but you don't necessarily actually increase total revenue or profits by doing it. So yeah, there's a little bit of a concern there. Now, again, the markets aren't they're not, it's not a monopoly, right? There are substitutes. So firms have to be careful about that, brand loyalty only goes so far. People do run out of money. You either have to have a great marketing campaign, right, and brand identity to be able to make sure that if there's not some meat to go behind it, you can't do that forever. So either, continue with amazing products. And again, you brought up Apple. Well, I mean, yes, they kept pumping out new phones and new products and various things that actually were, really cool and people really liked them. So there's a little bit of the hype with Apple, but I think there was also a quality product as well. But we saw their demand weaken a little bit too once the iPhone updates weren't really that shockingly different anymore, right? The capabilities weren't exactly, light years above the last model. And so you'll see that too. But yeah, there's concern there for sure.
Yeah. I think the thing that Nintendo does have, right? Because a lot of these games you can play on any system, except for first-party games that Nintendo makes, right? So the Mario Karts, the new Donkey Kong game that's coming out. Like, obviously, you can't play that anywhere else but Nintendo. So, and then on a side note, the games they announced that these games will be $80, which is like shocking, right? $70-$80. Which I don't know, it's new for consumers in the in the game industry to be like, really, we're asking for that now. So it's just an interesting time right now. And then you add the threat of tariffs. Now, we'll say, as the time of this recording, Nintendo has not raised their prices. They have not said we're going to increase the prices of the Switch due to the tariffs. They just said we're not allowing for pre-orders to happen at this point. So
what they're waiting for is to see if they're still on when they actually are shipping.
Probably. Well, and this is my next question. So they're going to release the Switch. They said, this is one thing Nintendo did say, and I'm saying Nintendo. This could apply to any game.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Right. So, but just because Nintendo is coming out with a new system, I think this is just really pertinent right now to talk about the impact that they're facing. But yeah, it's gonna impact Sony. It's gonna impact Microsoft. It's gonna impact
for sure
any of those industries.
Maybe less Microsoft, given the fact that depending on where their production is, right?
Yeah.
I mean, but if the production is abroad, right, they will be subject to tariffs when they come back in, even if it's a U.S. company.
Yeah, and I'm sure that I don't think that they're building.
Yeah, I don't think they're building in Washington.
No. But one of the things the Switch is going to release in June. I think June 5th or 9th. I don't remember. It's one of those dates. But there's talks that there's already product in the store, like waiting for people to buy. So I guess my question to you then is, like, do these tariffs apply to only products that are being manufactured now? Or do they also affect the products that have been built and currently in stock waiting to be sold, but they're not obviously for sale yet?
Sure. So a tariff is not a manufacturing tax. It's an import tax. Okay. So when so it's really depends on where they're produced. So the items that are produced, but if they're sitting in Japan and haven't been actually imported yet, those are subject to the tariffs.
Okay.
If they are sitting in the U.S., right, like they're behind the locked doors somewhere waiting, in the US.
Yeah.
Like those, right, in theory, they are not subject to the tariff because they've already cleared customs. So it happens when they hit customs is the tariff.
Okay.
So the issue, however, is then, though, you do get into the point of, well, technically those aren't subject to tariffs.
Yeah.
But then you get into, well, if they're going to be accustomed to tariffs in the future, now I have some market power. Maybe I raise the price a little bit, blame it on tariffs, and people are going to buy it anyway, right? I don't know. Companies, get a lot of bad press for things like that, but I mean, it's totally legit. Like it is kind of like, how do you differentiate between, something that why would you differentiate perhaps between a shipment that got in pre-tariffs and did not have that cost that's sitting here, and then a different, store or distributor happened to get the shipment 2 days later and all of a sudden is subject to tariffs. And so you're going to charge more there than the other. I mean, the stores themselves are going to be, well, it might be better for the consumer, like the store that ends up getting the higher price shipment and losing all their sales because it's cheaper down the road. They're not going to be happy about that. So there's going to most likely be one price, no matter whether those particular units were technically subject to the tariff or not. And I honestly have no idea whether or not, my guess is if they're not releasing it for another 2 months, they could be in the US already, right? Produced and sitting here.
Right.
Probably not. I'm guessing nobody really wants to keep them and store them quite that long.
Yeah. Just take up a warehouse space for the stuff. Maybe.
Because it's cheaper in the US.
Well, so I think the only reason I would think that maybe they're sitting in the US because the idea was that you could pre-order from Best Buy, from Walmart, and they would want to know how much they have in stock to be able to fulfill those pre-orders. Maybe.
Sure. No, and that may be, right? Well, it depends what kind of distribution system Nintendo promised too. If it's a really tight shipment time, then they could get all those pre-orders and still have plenty of time to actually ship the product. But again, it wouldn't be too surprising if they do have, some stock around.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to ask a kind of, I think this might be a hard question to answer, but I'll ask it anyway. So are there risks that these tariffs could discourage foreign investment in the U.S. gaming market or limit game availability?
Well, I think there's always risks, right? And that's the part of the thing here is the uncertainty related to tariffs, saying, this is going to happen and this is going to happen, this is going to happen. Yeah, there's a whole web here, right? Everything's connected.
Yeah.
And so being able to say precisely exactly what's going to happen, that's can't be done, right? Because there's ripple effects. And it's a little bit different here because we're talking about a pretty specific product, and really we're talking about the end product here. Like, again, if we're talking about the Switch too. So you're not using the Switch 2 as an input in production of something else, right?
Right.
It gets trickier if you're talking about a steel tariff driving up the price of steel. Well, sure, maybe it creates a couple extra jobs in the U.S. steel industry, but you neglect the fact that by raising the price of steel, every industry that uses steel as an input has now gotten more expensive and lost sales and probably laid people off, right? So it's not just a one industry or one product. In some contexts, one could argue that if foreign production, or in this case, what we mean by foreign is non-U.S. production, is inherently more expensive because of the tariffs, it would create an incentive to invest in the U.S., at least in production, because of the fact that you're not subject to the tariff. But it really is going to depend on, again, how confident those companies are that these tariffs are actually going to stick around.
Yeah.
How big the tariff is relative to the cost of production that they'd have. And honestly, like, even if I put final assembly in the United States, if I'm still importing, chips from Taiwan or, different producers, you're still importing a lot of components that are subject to the tariff, right?
Yeah.
So in terms of game availability, I think it's another factor that gets to be, it gets to be a little bit problematic in terms of, depends what the profitability of the company is. Can they can they absorb higher production costs and higher sale prices? What is that going to do to the demand for their product? I think it depends. Again, I think people are still going to buy Switches. Are they going to get? I mean, who knows? We'll see. Maybe we're wrong. This will be a good experiment again about unexpected tariffs and the inelasticity of demand for. No. There's a paper here, Roger.
Yeah, I was gonna say you could write a paper on this, right? This is but I think that's an interesting discussion because the industry is also, whether you're a fan of this or not, I mean, a lot of people are upset about this. A lot of people are like, whatever, it doesn't really matter. But moving away from physical media to digital media, and right now the cost is the same, regardless if you buy physical or digital media. The cost is the same. I don't know. Maybe that might change with the cost of chips if they're being, like you said, produced somewhere else, and that cost then goes up, has to be passed on to the consumer. I would guess that if the physical cost goes up, probably the digital cost goes up. I don't see them saying, "Oh, we'll bring the cost of digital cost down," unless, of course, the demand for the games are not there, and then maybe they might do that at that point. So it's weird.
I mean, the prices tend to match because, I mean, I know we think, well, digital should be cheaper, or it's down. Again, there's no cost of production, but I'm guessing the materials cost for most of these things are probably relatively trivial when it comes down to it, right? Most of it's the design cost that you're recuperating, but you also don't necessarily want to create a cheaper competitor internally, right? I mean, so if you price the digital download at 30% less, well, yes, you may get some people who are absolutely like, no, I want a physical product, right? But you could also be completely undercutting your own organization, and then you're investing money to produce these physical units that nobody wants, right? So that's why they tend to be at least pretty close to parity.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so my last question, you kind of alluded to this, might be difficult, but I'm going to ask it anyway. How do you see this situation playing out over the next several months? Do you think companies like Nintendo, like Sony, like Microsoft will find ways to adapt, or will these tariffs have lasting impact on the industry?
Well, I think there's going to be any lasting impact is going to depend on, frankly, how long these things stick around. Right. And what we saw, I mean, with the implementation, there was steady delay, essentially, right? Like there's threats like, we're going to do this, and then, we're going to pause and wait another week. And eventually, anytime markets tend to price in expectations. So they expect tariffs where you're going to see companies adapt even before they happen, if they trust it. Once you saw some of this and consistently getting pushed back, I think companies couldn't necessarily as confidently plan because they didn't actually know whether it was going to happen.
Yeah.
So looking forward, then, the analog to that is if they trust that these are going to be long lasting, then there's going to be resolution, right? They will do something to, again, change sources of production. And again, maybe it's, as this evolves, right? Maybe Cambodia and Vietnam in this example, well, maybe they're not quite as, blacklisted as, say, China, right?
Yeah.
That one I think is going to be pretty prolonged. Well, and if things ease in those markets, great, right? Or again, maybe it is looking for at least bringing into the U.S. market some production, if it's final assembly or, hard to say.
Yeah.
But if their view that these are going to be short term, this is something that consumers are going to rebel against because it will raise prices, right? And for a variety of things, right? I mean, it's anything we import, really. You will see higher prices, and it depends how long the administration can wait that out.
Yeah.
And if companies are particularly for in this context, if people are going to buy it for another $100 anyway, well, I don't have a real incentive if I'm Nintendo to really do much about that. Yeah. Now, to be fair, let's, if the price goes up by 25%, the company does not get to keep that extra 25%. That is going as a tax to the U.S. government. So it's not like Nintendo itself is necessarily benefiting from that.
Yeah.
But if they're also not being hurt by it, why invest a lot, completely rework supply chains to try to get around it?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, right, the more variable, the more short term these are expected to be, I say the less adjustments that are probably going to happen. And, I don't know, we see a lot of things change relatively quickly, in this administration at times. So I really can't say one way or the other where this is going to go.
Yeah.
But it will be a footnote at the very, very least about, something that happens. And I think one other point, again, not to go too deep into it, but I think it depends on the relative value of the U.S. market. I think the U.S. market for games probably relatively large, but it could be, again, I'll be honest, I'm not that knowledgeable about this, but if it's, we may find out that it's not as large as it thinks it is, and perhaps then you cater to European or Asian demand, and these companies shift away from products that might be more suited towards the U.S. market. And well, if tariffs have allowed them, made the U.S. market relatively less profitable, well, I'm going to shift my design and my production towards other market desires, basically. So that could be a lasting impact too.
Yeah,
I tend to think we're probably a pretty big chunk of global gaming demand, at least a non-trivial one. So but again, it depends how long they expect them to last.
Yeah. And one thing that we haven't talked about is the fact that when there's global tariffs like this, everything goes up, which means the cost of clothing, the cost of food, the cost of, cars, the things, necessities, cell phones, the things that you need are going to go up. So the needs, things that are entertainment, like Nintendo, could tend to be cut out of people's budget because they're paying for everything else, right? So
I mean, and that's it, right? I mean, that's another part of this too, and these are the webs of the effect, right?
Yeah,
like how widespread? What is the impact of? How big is the impact on food and, like you said, necessities? And right, some of these, it's not a true luxury good, but some of that might be more of a, where there's substitutes, where I'm going to substitute a different form of entertainment for a little bit.
Yeah.
And this is really where we're going to see, what does substitute for a Nintendo Switch? We're going to see, right?
It's my backlog of games that I have. I don't need a new Switch. That's the thing, right?
Well, really, in consumers, I mean, what do? You might wait, and you might not be pre-ordering, and you might not be ordering it, the first week or two. Let's wait a month and see how this goes, right?
Yeah.
Well, and that then it could be, right? If enough people do that, then Nintendo may be, all right, well, then I do have to actually bear a little bit of the pain by, lowering price to still generate sales, right? Yeah. I'm guessing they have enough market power in this situation where they may take a little bit of a hit, and they're probably not real happy with the timing of all of this.
Yeah.
But I still think that they probably are going to do okay.
Yeah, I think so too. And
poor Nintendo, right?
Poor Nintendo. Well, I was going to say,
100 and some years? Like, how long have they been around?
Yeah, a very long time.
Making cards or something?
Yeah. Well, and it could be. I mean, it's funny. I'm going to say this. There could be a goodwill story if they don't raise their prices, right? And they eat the cost. That being said, I did watch their stream of when they released the Switch, and then they highlighted all these games. They were live streaming all this stuff, and the chat was just flooded with, drop the price, drop the price, drop the price, drop the price, drop the price. This is before the tariffs were even announced. So I don't know. It's an interesting situation. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for joining me tonight and talking about this timely topic.
They know you didn't pre-record this like 2 months in advance.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But when all this was going down, I was like, "Do you want to be on the podcast? You want to talk?"
I love it. Yeah, it's awesome. Like I said, in my new role, I mostly do student recruitment and marketing and sales. Now it seems as the head of the department, it's recruitment. So I haven't really played economist for too long. So
well, I'm glad I gave you that opportunity. So
I impersonate one on a podcast. How about that?
You stayed at a Holiday Inn once too, right? So
yeah, right.
Listeners, thank you so much for giving this episode a listen. And if you have time, we'd love to hear what you have to say about the show. Leave us a review. We'll love to read it on the show. Until next week, everyone, stay safe and game on. I'll talk to you later. Bye.